They called it a funeral. She called it the opening move. When the Galactic Empire killed her husband, they expected tears and submission. Instead, they got a widow who traced his coffin and whispered, "Never show your hand too soon." This is how one woman's quiet revenge dismantled an empire from within, using nothing but patience and a smile. The ceremonial hall was filled with alien dignitaries who saw only human fragility in her tears. She stood beside the preservation coffin, the Empire's trophy displayed for galactic scrutiny. Their sensors detected grief patterns but missed the tactical calculations beneath the surface. Her fingers traced the coffin's edge in a gesture they misinterpreted as mourning. She whispered words that would become the foundation of her campaign. "Never show your hand too soon." The alien observers recorded her biological responses but failed to measure her resolve. This moment established the fundamental misreading that would doom the Empire. Her smile was the first weapon drawn in a war they didn't know had begun. What did the widow whisper to her dead husband's coffin that made alien dignitaries shift uncomfortably in their seats? The words were almost inaudible, a breath against polished metal. "I know what you gave me," she murmured, her lips barely moving. Every defensive grid pattern, every supply route. Their arrogance wrote the manual for their own destruction. She let a single tear trace the exact path her finger had taken moments before, a perfect performance of grief. "Sleep now. I'll wake them when it's time." The aliens shifted in their seats not from understanding but from discomfort at human emotional display. They saw only sentiment where she had just activated the first phase of a campaign. Her husband hadn't just been a general, he'd been a living archive of imperial vulnerabilities, and he'd spent their last year together transferring everything he knew through what appeared to be pillow talk and domestic routine. Their sensors registered elevated heart rate and moisture in the eyes, standard grief indicators. They completely missed the strategic cataloging happening behind her measured breaths. As she leaned against the coffin, she was mentally reviewing attack vectors based on maintenance schedules he'd described over breakfast. When she wiped her cheek, she was calculating which Imperial commanders would defect first based on personal loyalties he'd mapped during their late-night conversations. The funeral ended. Her work began. She walked from the hall with measured steps, her black dress swirling like shadow. The aliens filed out behind her, already composing reports about human emotional fragility and recommended psychological monitoring protocols. They didn't notice how her hand lingered at her waist, fingers tapping a rhythmic count against her hip, the same count her husband used to synchronize fleet movements. Outside, the Imperial Honor Guard stood at attention, their polished armor reflecting a galaxy that thought itself secure. She paused between them, a black figure between walls of glittering force, and for just a moment her eyes scanned their formation, not as a mourner, but as a tactician assessing weak points. Then she was gone into the waiting transport, the door sealing behind her with a sound like a weapon being charged. Inside, alone at last, she opened her palm. A single data chip lay there, pressed from the coffin's hidden compartment during that final tracing gesture. The Empire had returned her husband's body as a trophy. They'd failed to remove his final intelligence drop. The transport lifted off. Below, the alien dignitaries dispersed to their ships, already forgetting the human widow. Above, the stars waited. She smiled again, this time with nothing to hide. The first move had been made. Alien psychologists analyzed her eulogy for emotional content rather than tactical doctrine. They measured vocal tremors and tear salinity, while missing the operational patterns woven through her words. She spoke not as senator or soldier, but as the wife who shared his coffee and weariness, describing morning routines and late-night conversations that sounded like simple domestic memories to alien ears. The Empire's intelligence dismissed her words as sentimental human weakness, filing them under psychological analysis rather than strategic threat assessment. She framed her husband's death not as tragedy, but as calculated investment with the phrase, "Sacrifice is the marrow of peace." The alien translators rendered this as poetic metaphor about grief processing. They missed how she was simultaneously signaling human resistance cells across 12 systems that the campaign had begun. This phrase would echo across star systems as both warning and battle cry, repeated in refugee camps and rebel hideouts while Imperial monitors classified it as cultural artifact. Her controlled tears masked the precision of a military planner assessing terrain. Each pause in her speech corresponded with planned communication windows. Each folded handkerchief gestured toward weaknesses in Imperial patrol routes her husband had documented during their years together. The poker metaphor became operational doctrine for her entire campaign when she described watching her husband play cards with junior officers. She spoke of how he'd say, "Never bet when they're watching your eyes. Bet when they're watching your hands." Alien translators rendered smile as facial expression rather than strategic posture. They didn't understand that when she said he taught me to smile at the wrong moments, she was describing counterintelligence tactics for misleading enemy psychological profiling. The entire eulogy functioned as encrypted battle doctrine wrapped in grief. Human resistance fighters listening on clandestine channels heard precise instructions about timing, coordination, and misdirection embedded in stories about breakfast conversations and shared silences. How did a simple phrase about poker become the blueprint for galactic warfare? The widow's description of her husband's card game tactics contained 7 layered meanings that became foundational to her campaign. When she said, "He never bluffed with his face, only with his chips," she was teaching human operatives to conceal their true strength while demonstrating exactly enough force to manipulate Imperial responses. The story about him folding a winning hand to learn an opponent's pattern became the model for sacrificing minor assets to map Imperial defense protocols. Every anecdote about card games contained operational parameters. The mention of reading tells became intelligence-gathering methodology. The description of pot odds calculated risk assessment formulas. The lesson about when to go all in established engagement thresholds. Human cells received these not as metaphors but as mathematical combat formulas wrapped in domestic nostalgia. Imperial analysts, meanwhile, filed notes about human mourning rituals involving game theory. They filed their reports on grief behavior and emotional processing. She filed her first move through a dead drop system activated by specific phrases in her eulogy. When she mentioned the deck we were dealt, 3 human sleeper agents began sabotaging Imperial supply depots. When she described playing the long game, resistance commanders knew to initiate Phase 2 infiltration patterns. The aliens measured her heart rate variability while she systematically activated a galaxy-wide resistance network using nothing but carefully chosen memories. The Imperial psychologists concluded she was processing loss through nostalgic idealization. They recommended monitoring for depressive symptoms. Meanwhile, across 7 sectors, human operatives were implementing the poker doctrine's first strategic plays, using misdirection and calculated risk exactly as the widow had just demonstrated through stories about her husband's card night habits. They thought she was remembering a dead man. She was issuing battle orders. The Empire approved her morning tour as therapeutic outreach. They provided diplomatic transport and cultural escorts, believing they were managing human emotional fragility. Each planet offered new soil for planting strategic seeds disguised as grief. Alien hosts presented condolences and ceremonial gestures, while she offered calibrated provocations wrapped in appreciation. Their security scanned for weapons and recording devices. They didn't scan for strategic questions embedded in conversations about art and architecture. On Varesh, she accepted hollow sympathy in polished reception halls while mentally mapping defense grid vulnerabilities. She asked about local energy sources as cultural curiosity, while cataloging power distribution nodes. Her compliments about architectural design noted structural weaknesses and sight lines. When her hosts showed pride in their planetary shield system, she asked about maintenance schedules as concern for civic upkeep. They explained rotational maintenance cycles while she memorized temporal gaps in coverage. Her aides recorded notes in human cursive script that appeared to alien observers as emotional journaling. The flowing handwriting concealed troop movement coordinates and infrastructure diagrams. Every teardrop blot on the paper masked a strategic notation. They used personal shorthand developed over years of marriage, codes based on domestic references that no alien cryptographer could break. Shopping lists contained resource allocation formulas. Recipe notes outlined supply chain vulnerabilities. Every conversation contained layered meanings they weren't equipped to detect. When she discussed mourning rituals, she was actually exchanging authentication signals with human resistance contacts in the room. Questions about local cuisine gathered intelligence on agricultural distribution networks. Comments about weather patterns correlated with orbital patrol schedules. She turned cultural exchange into tactical reconnaissance by asking the right questions with the wrong inflections. The Empire's security protocols were designed for weapons, not words. They scanned her ship for explosives, but not for the patterns in her conversation. They monitored energy signatures, but not the strategic implications of her polite inquiries. When she admired viewports overlooking military installations, they saw only a widow seeking distraction. When she asked about public transit systems, they heard only civilian curiosity. How did the widow turn a morning tour into a galaxy-spanning intelligence operation? She used each stop to activate dormant human assets through coded phrases and gestures. A specific way of holding a drink glass signaled readiness states. Particular flower choices in her hair indicated which intelligence priorities to pursue. She gathered information through seemingly innocent questions about local customs, while simultaneously distributing attack parameters through subtle body language. At every reception, she positioned herself near officials who possessed useful knowledge. She asked about their work-life balance and learned shift change patterns. She inquired about family traditions and uncovered loyalty fractures within imperial ranks. When she spoke of her husband's love for specific foods, she was actually signaling which supply lines to target first. Her performances of grief covered precise intelligence gathering from multiple sources simultaneously. The aliens provided her with detailed, cultural briefings that included infrastructure, 自豪感和军事部署信息. They thought they were educating a grieving widow about their civilization's achievements. She was actually receiving organized intelligence packages wrapped as hospitality. Tour guides proudly explained transportation networks that happened to serve military bases. Cultural attendants described festival routes that followed defensive perimeter patterns. She moved to the next system. Their defenses remained unchanged, but now fully documented in her aide's journals, disguised as travel notes and emotional reflections. The Imperial Security Forces registered her departure as another successful cultural outreach operation. They filed reports about human emotional processing and recommended continued monitored exposure to alien civilizations. They never considered that the woman in black had just completed the most comprehensive intelligence survey of their defensive capabilities ever conducted by an enemy agent. Alien nobles found her stories about human domestic life charmingly primitive. They leaned forward in velvet chairs, amusement flickering across features not designed for human expressions. She spoke of coffee rituals and burnt toast as if sharing cultural curiosities, her hands tracing patterns in the air that mimicked steam rising from morning cups. They offered sympathetic nods while missing the operational diagrams she was drawing with every anecdote. Beneath the anecdotes lay patterns for supply chain disruption. When she described her husband's precise morning routine, water temperature, grind consistency, brewing time, she was actually detailing Imperial fuel refinement schedules and transportation timetables. The story about always burning the first batch of toast corresponded exactly with the Empire's practice of sacrificing initial production runs for quality control calibration. They heard nostalgia where she was delivering attack parameters. Her description of morning routines mapped onto Imperial logistics schedules. The way she explained measuring coffee grounds by weight instead of volume translated to payload calculations for cargo transports. The specific time she mentioned the coffee maker activating, 6:17 a.m., matched the daily shift change at 3 major Imperial dockyards. They thought she was sharing intimate marital memories while she was providing synchronized strike timings. The story of sleepless nights corresponded with shift changes at key facilities. When she described watching her husband work through the night, stirring his coffee as reports came in, she was identifying the precise hours when Imperial command centers were understaffed during transition periods. The number of sugar cubes she mentioned him using became the code for how many assets to deploy against specific targets. They laughed at human sentimental attachments to simple beverages. Their amusement echoed through marble halls as she described the particular ceramic mug he preferred, the way he'd warm his hands around it during strategy sessions. They missed how she was simultaneously signaling which Imperial communication channels were most vulnerable based on their heat signature patterns. The description of coffee stains on documents became instructions for targeting data storage facilities. Meanwhile, her operatives were already moving against their infrastructure. As alien nobles chuckled over human quaintness, teams were positioning themselves at the exact locations and times she had just described through domestic stories. The tale about forgetting to buy coffee beans became the signal to initiate supply line interruptions. The anecdote about a broken grinder instructed teams to target maintenance facilities. What they dismissed as quaint human tradition became operational intelligence. Every detail about morning rituals contained actionable data. The specific brand of coffee mentioned correlated to Imperial resource extraction sites. The description of cream swirling into black coffee illustrated patrol route patterns. The story about measuring water temperature provided the exact thermal tolerance thresholds of Imperial shield generators. What seemingly innocent stories about coffee were actually coded battle instructions? The widow's description of her husband's coffee habits contained 17 distinct attack parameters. When she mentioned he took his coffee black, she was signaling that primary targets should be hit without secondary support. The story about him forgetting sugar indicated that sweetener depots, code for fuel storage facilities, should be bypassed initially. The anecdote about spilled coffee becoming a stain map directed teams to create diversionary attacks at specific coordinates. They served refreshments in delicate crystal cups, believing they were participating in cultural exchange. She accepted the offered drinks with a gracious nod, her fingers curling around the warmth exactly as her husband's had around his tactical mug. As they discussed the subtle notes of alien beverages, she was finalizing attack sequences in her mind, each sip timed to coincide with movements happening light years away. They served refreshments. She served them defeat. The clink of ceramic against saucer masked the sound of Imperial infrastructure beginning to fail across 6 sectors. The aliens tasted exotic blends while their supply lines tasted disruption. Her smile as she complimented their hospitality was the same smile she'd used when reviewing attack plans with her husband. The coffee gambit had succeeded. The amphibious nobles of Carthan Prime found human circular motion fascinating. Their webbed fingers traced patterns in the humid air, attempting to replicate the arcs she demonstrated. She explained baseball as simple terrestrial amusement, a game of spheres and strikes and home runs. They watched her hands move through pitching motions and batting swings, seeing only primitive recreation where she was illustrating orbital insertion patterns and kinetic engagement vectors. She stood in their dripping audience chamber, water cascading down crystalline walls, and demonstrated how outfielders position themselves in overlapping arcs. Her hands swept through the air showing coverage patterns that perfectly mirrored fleet deployment formations. The Carthans nodded their bulbous heads, amusement flickering across moist skin. They asked about scoring systems and team loyalties, while she described encirclement protocols and reinforcement timing. The concept of closing circles became the basis for encirclement tactics. When she explained how fielders converge on a pop fly, she was actually detailing multi-vector assault coordination. The infield shift demonstration showed flanking maneuvers. The description of a pitcher staring down a batter illustrated target acquisition procedures. They thought she was discussing sportsmanship while she was outlining siege warfare fundamentals. Her hands moved in precise arcs that mirrored fleet deployment patterns. Each gesture contained tactical information. The angle of a curveball corresponded to attack approach vectors. The height of a fly ball indicated altitude parameters for atmospheric entry. She used baseball terminology to describe military operations without triggering their security monitoring. A double play became pincer movement. A full count signaled maximum engagement readiness. They discussed sports while she discussed warfare. Their cultural experts recorded notes about human recreational activities, filing reports on baseball rules and equipment specifications. Her military planners received converted data about Carthan defensive gaps and response times. When she described the field of play, she was mapping their planetary defense grid. When she explained rain delay procedures, she was detailing their weather-based sensor blind spots. How did casual dinner conversations plant the seeds for coordinated military strikes? The widow used baseball analogies to distribute attack parameters to human operatives listening through concealed channels. Each story about game strategy contained actual battle plans. The description of a catcher signaling pitches coordinated fleet movements. The explanation of base running tactics established infiltration routes. Even the snack traditions, peanuts and Cracker Jack, coded resource allocation formulas. When she demonstrated the wind-up for a fastball, she was showing the proper arm angle for torpedo launches. The discussion of stolen bases outlined rapid strike and extraction procedures. The explanation of foul balls identified acceptable collateral damage parameters. Every aspect of the game became a military lesson wrapped in athletic metaphor. The Carthans asked about uniforms and team mascots while she provided the exact timing for their orbital defense grid's rotational gaps. They applauded the demonstration, their moist palms making soft slapping sounds that echoed through the chamber. She smiled and gave a slight bow, the same motion she'd used to acknowledge a coordinated strike success. The circle strategy had been implanted completely unnoticed. Their cultural databases now contained detailed baseball documentation that would later be recognized as the exact blueprint for their own encirclement and defeat. The Widow had turned home plate into a targeting computer and outfield coverage into fleet coordination manuals. They returned to discussing tidal patterns and aqueous agriculture, believing they had enjoyed a charming cultural exchange. She nodded politely, while mentally reviewing the defensive vulnerabilities she had just documented through sports analogy. The Carthan Defense Ministry would later wonder how human forces knew exactly when to strike during hydrostorm sensor blackouts. They never connected it to the Widow's explanation of rain delay protocols. The Orlac senator believed sentiment was humanity's primary weakness. His scaled face twisted in what passed for a smile among his species, sharp teeth glinting under the negotiation chamber's lights. He leaned across the polished table, pheromones of contempt swirling through the recycled air. "Your emotional attachments make you predictable," he hissed, clicking claws against the surface. "We calculate, you feel. This is why you lose." The Widow sat perfectly still, her black garment seeming to absorb the chamber's harsh lighting. She watched him not as an opponent but as a system to be understood. Her husband's teachings about reading tells now applied to interstellar diplomacy. The senator mistook her calm for submission, her silence for defeat. His sensors scanned her physiological responses and found only the steady rhythms of controlled breathing. He saw a grieving woman where she was a tactician assessing terrain. She responded with 7 words that would haunt him later. "Sentiment hides nothing," she said, her voice barely disturbing the air between them. "It reveals, but not all at once." The senator's translation device rendered this as philosophical musing about grief processing. His security team logged it as emotional deflection. Their instruments detected no aggression in her tone, no threat in her posture. They classified the exchange as cultural misunderstanding and moved to the next agenda item. 2 weeks later, his sector's defense network suffered coordinated failures. Power grids went dark in rolling blackouts that followed patrol rotation schedules. Communication relays failed during shift changes. Supply depots reported inventory discrepancies that matched maintenance cycle patterns. The attacks showed precise understanding of Imperial procedures and timing. Response teams found no weapon signatures, no fleet movements, no conventional assault patterns. The senator reviewed the security footage from their meeting as reports of the disruptions flooded his command center. He watched the Widow's hands resting on the table, how her fingers had tapped twice after speaking those 7 words. He saw how her eyes had tracked the chronometer on the wall exactly 14 minutes into their conversation. He noticed the specific way she had folded her datapad, a precise angle that matched the attack vectors now, crippling his sector. What made the Orlac senator realize, too late, that human sentiment was actually a weapon? The patterns, the timing, the precision. Her comment about sentiment revealing things not all at once described exactly how the attacks unfolded. Not simultaneous strikes, but carefully sequenced disruptions that built upon each other. The 2 taps of her fingers corresponded to the 2-hour delay before the first systems failed. The chronometer glance marked the activation signal. He finally understood that her calm hadn't been submission but timing. Her emotional control wasn't weakness but weaponized patience. The senator had taunted her about sentiment making humans predictable, but she had used that predictability against him. His own arrogance became the delivery system for her response. The attacks followed the exact patterns they discussed during what he'd classified as cultural exchange. His boasts about imperial efficiency had provided the blueprint for their disruption. The evidence was there in plain sight on the recording. Her measured breathing had matched optimal combat rhythm. Her steady pulse indicated focus, not fear. Even the black fabric of her clothing had served tactical purpose, absorbing light to make her harder to read on sensors. Every aspect of her presentation had been calculated, Yet he'd seen only what his prejudice expected to see. The widow hadn't just been holding her emotions in check, she'd been using them as camouflage for strategic planning. He sat in his failing command center, scales dull under emergency lighting, and finally comprehended the horror of human sentiment weaponized. It wasn't about rage or grief-driving actions. It was about using emotional expectation as strategic misdirection. They'd prepared for tearful appeals or angry demands. They hadn't prepared for patience. They hadn't prepared for someone who treated vengeance like a fine vintage to be opened at precisely the right moment. The senator reached for his communication panel to report this revelation, but the channels were already silent. Alien security reports noted she smiled too much for a grieving widow. Their psychological profiles suggested either denial or mental instability. The analysts wrote lengthy assessments about human coping mechanisms and emotional processing cycles. They recommended monitoring for breakdowns or erratic behavior. Their sensors tracked every twitch of her facial muscles, every fluctuation in her stress hormones. They completely missed that they were measuring the wrong things. They failed to recognize predator behavior patterns in human social rituals. Their databases contained thousands of entries on human emotional expression, but nothing about tactical smiling. They studied grief responses and mourning customs, but not how humans conceal strategy behind social conventions. When she smiled at memorial services, they saw maladaptive behavior. She saw calculated communication with embedded operatives. On Firaxis, an elder alien whispered warnings about smiling before the kill. His species had evolved alongside natural predators that bared teeth before attacking. He tried to explain this biological warning system to Imperial security. The Empire's analysts dismissed this as primitive superstition. They classified his concerns as cultural artifact rather than tactical insight. Their arrogance blinded them to cross-species behavioral patterns. Her smiles coincided with defection patterns among Imperial allies. When she smiled during a trade negotiation, 3 border worlds began secret communications with human resistance forces. When she smiled at a cultural exchange, 2 Imperial admirals suddenly requested transfers. The security teams noted the temporal correlation but dismissed it as coincidence. They were looking for weapons and threats, not social signals. Each pleasant expression masked a strategic calculation in progress. Her smile at a state dinner corresponded with finalizing attack timetables. Her gentle grin during a museum tour confirmed asset placements. The slight upturn of her lips when accepting condolences signaled activation codes. They monitored her facial muscles while missing her operational movements. Their scanners detected micro-expressions, but not the fleet movements those expressions commanded. Why did alien leaders mistake human grief for weakness when it was actually strategic calculation? Their cultural bias defined emotion as vulnerability. Their own species expressed threat through physical posturing and chemical signals. Humans used social rituals as both shield and weapon. They expected tears and collapse from a widow. They received smiles and precise planning. Their psychological models had no category for calculated emotional presentation as warfare. The widow's smiles followed specific patterns her husband had documented during their intelligence work. He'd spent years studying how Imperial security interpreted human behavior. He knew they would look for obvious signs of aggression or subterfuge. They wouldn't consider that a grieving woman's pleasant expression could be coordinating multi-system operations. His research became her playbook. They updated her profile to include inappropriate affect and possible detachment from reality. She updated her timeline to accelerate the final phase. Their revised assessment suggested increased psychological monitoring. Her revised plans called for simultaneous strikes across 9 sectors. They increased the frequency of her psychological evaluations. She increased the frequency of her coded communications. The security teams finally noticed the pattern days before the collapse. A junior analyst cross-referenced her appearance schedules with Imperial stability metrics. The correlation was undeniable, but by then incomprehensible. How could a woman's smile at a poetry reading coincide with coordinated infrastructure failures? How could her pleasant expression during a garden tour match exactly with defensive grid overloads? They brought in cultural anthropologists and emotional behavior specialists. They studied human comedy traditions and social bonding rituals. They completely missed that she was using smiles as synchronization signals. Each expression timed to coordinate movements across light years of space. The wider the smile, the more critical the operation. They were measuring lip curvature while her fleets were moving into position. They updated her profile one final time, adding potential psychological warfare operative to the assessment. She had already completed her final smile of the campaign, a slight, satisfied expression as she watched the first Imperial command centers go dark. The update reached security headquarters just as their own systems failed. The warning came precisely 7 minutes too late. The senator from Xylos arrived drunk to the diplomatic reception, his carapace gleaming under the lights, with what his culture considered festive moisture. He moved through the crowd with the unsteady confidence of someone who believed his position made him untouchable. When he reached the widow, he didn't offer condolences. Instead, he leaned close, his breath carrying the sharp scent of fermented spores, and made comments about human women's fragility. He implied things about her marriage and her worth, believing such provocations would reveal emotional weakness. His species measured strength by immediate aggressive response. They respected confrontation, understood rage, had protocols for physical challenges. When the widow didn't flinch or raise her voice, when her pulse remained steady under their sensors, he interpreted this as confirmation of human inferiority. He expected tears or shouting or at least some display of anger that would justify his contempt. Instead, she regarded him with the calm assessment of a physicist observing failed experiment. She answered with 7 words that sounded like philosophical deflection to the Imperial observers recording the exchange. Strength is measured by how long one endures. The senator laughed, a wet clicking sound that made nearby diplomats uncomfortable. His translators rendered this as sentimental human wisdom about patience. His security team logged it as non-threatening response to provocation. They completely missed that she had just declared war on his entire world with a precise timetable. 14 standard cycles later, his world's shipyards burned in coordinated strikes that followed no conventional military pattern. The attacks didn't come from fleet engagements or orbital bombardment. They emerged from within the systems themselves, maintenance drones reprogrammed to target fuel lines, cooling systems that suddenly failed during critical operations, navigation beacons that transmitted false coordinates into incoming traffic. The destruction unfolded with surgical precision, against targets that hadn't been identified as vulnerable in any Imperial defense database. The attacks followed, patterns discussed during what the senator had considered social humiliation. His comments about human reproductive habits had covered conversations about manufacturing cycles. His insults about emotional weakness had masked questions about backup system redundancies. Every crude remark had given her another piece of his world's defensive posture. She had endured his provocation not because she was weak, but because she was gathering intelligence. His humiliation became a lesson in human temporal warfare when he realized the attacks coincided exactly with his personal schedule. The first explosions occurred as he was preparing for what should have been a triumphant speech about Imperial dominance. The final systems failed as he received confirmation that his family's industrial holdings were completely destroyed. The widow had not just attacked his world, she had timed it to maximize personal devastation. What happened when the drunk senator insulted the widow's strength was that she treated his provocation as intelligence-gathering opportunity. His crude comments about human women contained boasts about his world's industrial capabilities. His drunken swagger revealed security vulnerabilities through anecdotes about his family's influence. She absorbed every detail while maintaining perfect composure, her calmness preventing him from realizing how much he was revealing. Why his world burned 2 weeks later was because she needed that time to position assets and coordinate the complex attack. Human cells already in place required specific activation signals. Maintenance workers who had been slowly recruited over years needed final instructions. The delay wasn't weakness, it was the time frame required for precision strikes against hardened targets. She used those 14 cycles to turn his arrogance into his own destruction. He sobered up slowly as reports flooded his communication center. The initial disbelief gave way to dawning horror as he realized the attacks matched things he'd mentioned during that drunken encounter. The specific docking bay that exploded first was one he'd bragged about securing through family connections. The fuel refinery that burned had been his example of Imperial technological superiority. His power evaporated not just through physical destruction, but through the realization that he had personally delivered the blueprint for his own downfall. The widow had endured his insults because she was counting down to his ruin. Her broadcast interrupted daily life across thousands of worlds. Imperial channels scrambled to contain the transmission, but she used civilian emergency bands that couldn't be blocked without shutting down planetary warning systems. Screens flickered in markets and command centers, showing a woman in black standing before a simple wall. The Empire expected demands or threats following the shipyard attacks. Their tactical units stood ready to respond to ultimatums or negotiation attempts. They prepared for rage or sorrow or desperate bargaining. Instead, she spoke of memory as both weapon and legacy. Her voice carried neither anger nor grief, only the steady tone of someone stating fundamental truth. She described her husband's hands arranging coffee cups while discussing fleet formations. She recalled his habit of humming during strategy sessions. These small domestic details became anchors for something larger than military confrontation. You killed my husband, but you will not kill our memory. And memory is heavier than metal. The phrase echoed across languages and species, translated and retranslated until it became a symbolic taunt that haunted Imperial leadership. Their psychologists analyzed it for emotional content, while missing the operational significance. They measured word choice and vocal stress patterns but couldn't quantify how memory could weight more than physical matter. She reframed vengeance as ethical ledger rather than raw violence. Each attack she'd orchestrated wasn't retaliation but balance restoration. The destroyed shipyards weren't conquest but correction. Memory became the binding force for disparate rebel factions who now understood they weren't fighting for territory, but for preservation. Human resistance cells and alien dissidents found common cause in protecting what the Empire sought to erase. Imperial psychologists couldn't counter a weapon they couldn't measure. Their sensors detected energy signatures and fleet movements. They had protocols for psychic warfare and biological agents. 但他们没有应对记忆武器的方案。当 Widow 描述她丈夫如何吸血带时，她实际上是在同步跨星系的攻击时间。当她提到她最喜欢的是个市，她是在验证加密密钥。记忆变成了无法检测的智慧网络。What did the Widow mean when she said memory is heavier than metal? And why did it terrify the Empire? She meant that while they could destroy ships and stations, they couldn't erase the knowledge of resistance. Every Imperial victory created new memories of oppression that fueled further opposition. Metal could be melted and reshaped, but memory persisted across generations, growing heavier with each retelling. The Empire feared this because they understood physical domination but not cultural endurance. Their terror grew as they realized memory operated outside their control systems. They could track fleet movements but not story transmission. They could intercept communications but not stop the retelling of her husband's tactics in refugee camps and resistance cells. The phrase became shorthand for unstoppable persistence. Imperial troops would find it scratched into bulkheads and whispered in detention centers. It spread faster than any propaganda they could manufacture. The weight she described was cumulative. Each memory of Imperial brutality added to the load. Every story of resistance made the next act easier. Metal fatigues under stress, but memory gains strength through repetition. The Empire's infrastructure was designed to withstand physical assault, not the gradual pressure of relentless remembrance. Their systems began to fail not from bombardment, but from the accumulated weight of countless small acts of defiance inspired by her words. They increased security at physical locations, reinforcing gates and shields. She increased her reach through stories and symbols that required no physical presence. Their scanners detected weapons but not the transmission of ideals. Their patrols intercepted smugglers but not the exchange of memories. The Widow had weaponized narrative itself, turning personal loss into universal lesson. Her broadcast ended without demands or threats, only the quiet statement that memory endures when empires fall. Security teams reviewed the transmission frame by frame, looking for hidden codes or signals. They found only a woman speaking calmly about her dead husband. Their analysts missed how the specific stories she chose corresponded with ongoing operations. The anecdote about coffee brewing times matched attack schedules. The description of his reading habits coordinated cell activations. Memory wasn't just metaphor, it was the delivery system for her entire campaign. They increased physical security measures, adding patrols and checkpoints. She increased psychological reach through the stories now spreading across Imperial space. Their reinforcements arrived at military installations to find morale already crumbling under the weight of her words. The metal of their weapons felt lighter than the memory of why they were fighting. The widow had demonstrated that the strongest armor couldn't protect against an idea whose time had come. She began using agricultural metaphors that confused imperial analysts. They categorized her speeches as environmental policy discussions and forwarded them to agricultural ministers. Their translation algorithms flagged terms like soil cultivation and harvest cycles as non-threatening ecological content. Meanwhile, human resistance cells received the same words as attack parameters and mobilization orders. Beneath the surface, she was issuing ultimatums through analogy. When she spoke at interstellar conferences about sustainable farming practices, she was actually describing occupation timelines and resource allocation formulas. Her discussion of crop rotation patterns mirrored fleet rotation schedules. The description of irrigation systems outlined supply line management. They heard agricultural advice where she delivered military doctrine. We are gardeners tending soil with patience, but burn our fields, salt our ground, and you will see what grows in fire. This phrase became tacit command across human fleets and resistance cells. Agricultural terminology transformed into operational code. Pruning meant eliminating specific targets. Composting referred to intelligence gathering from captured assets. Harvest signaled coordinated attack initiation. The entire metaphor structure became a command language invisible to imperial monitoring. The empire's agricultural ministers actually responded with soil management proposals. They sent detailed reports about terraforming techniques and crop yield optimization. Their experts offered to share advanced irrigation technology and genetic modification research. They completely missed that her gardening references were describing how to dismantle their military infrastructure. Their databases filled with agricultural data while human operatives used that same terminology to coordinate strikes. Meanwhile, her operatives were preparing scorched earth protocols. When she mentioned controlled burns, she was authorizing demolition of imperial infrastructure. The term weed removal targeted specific officials for extraction or elimination. Soil enrichment, coordinated resource redistribution from imperial stores to human colonies. Each gardening term contained precise operational parameters that resistance cells executed with agricultural precision. They discussed crop rotation, while she discussed orbital bombardment. Imperial agronomists held symposiums about sustainable farming, while human commanders implemented siege patterns based on her planting metaphors. The mention of seasonal planting established attack timetables. Fertilizer distribution coordinated logistics movements. Even pest control became the code for dealing with imperial informants. How did the widow coordinate fleet movements using only polite conversation? She used agricultural terminology as encrypted command structure. When she spoke about plowing patterns, she was detailing fleet formation changes. The discussion of seed distribution coordinated scout ship deployments. References to weather patterns provided intelligence about imperial patrol schedules. Each metaphor contained mathematical precision wrapped in rural imagery. Human operatives understood that irrigation timing meant synchronization of attacks across multiple systems. Greenhouse maintenance indicated defense of captured territories. Compost temperature control regulated the pace of operations. The entire agricultural lexicon became a military command language that imperial analysts dismissed as ecological idealism. They sent agricultural experts with soil samples and planting schedules. These teams arrived at human colonies expecting to discuss crop yields and water conservation. They found populations that smiled politely and discussed farming techniques while secretly coordinating the final phase of the campaign. The experts returned with detailed reports about human agricultural practices, completely missing that they'd been given front-row seats to military preparation. She sent fire instead of fertilizer. While imperial agricultural ministers reviewed crop rotation proposals, human ships began systematic destruction of imperial supply depots. The attacks followed the exact patterns she'd described in her gardening metaphors. The controlled burns targeted fuel storage. The weed removal eliminated key commanders. The harvest collected surrendered imperial assets. The gardening analogy had provided perfect cover for military buildup. They finally understood the metaphor when their own fields burned. Imperial commanders watched their infrastructure collapse and realized too late that her agricultural terms had been precise battle plans. The widow had taught them about human farming while planning their famine. Their databases filled with useless agricultural data While their military capabilities withered from lack of resources, the experts had studied soil composition while she salted their ground. The Empire's leadership finally convened to discuss the widow problem. They sat in their command center, alien faces glowing in the holographic displays, and reviewed the same reports that had been misleading them for cycles. Their intelligence summaries showed no conventional military buildup, no fleet movements, no weapons production spikes. The data indicated only a grieving human woman conducting cultural exchanges and giving interviews about loss. They couldn't reconcile diplomatic pleasantries with operational damage. The disconnect frustrated their analytical frameworks. Their security systems were designed against weapons, not words against perception. They had protocols for detecting warships and scanning for explosives. They could trace energy signatures and intercept encrypted communications. But they had no sensors for measuring the impact of a well-timed story or the strategic value of a shared memory. Their entire defense infrastructure assumed enemies would attack with force, not with conversation. They dismissed the idea that a single human woman could coordinate galactic rebellion. Their cultural bias prevented them from seeing the pattern. They viewed humans as emotional and disorganized, incapable of the discipline required for coordinated action. Their assessment reports consistently described her as unlikely threat vector and non-strategic actor. They focused on traditional, military indicators while she built networks of loyalty through shared grievances and carefully crafted narratives. Their arrogance prevented them from seeing the pattern until it was too late. They trusted their technological superiority and organizational structure. They believed their empire's size and resources made them invulnerable to unconventional threats. When systems began failing, they looked for saboteurs and infiltrators rather than examining how their own arrogance had created the vulnerabilities she exploited. They focused on fleet movements, while she moved entire populations. Their sensors tracked warships and transport vessels, but couldn't detect shifting loyalties or changing allegiances. They monitored communication channels for military traffic, but missed the stories and symbols that were turning their subjects against them. Their maps showed territory control while her influence spread through cultural transmission. Their sensors detected ships but not shifting loyalties. They could count warships and measure firepower, but had no instruments for quantifying morale or commitment. When Imperial troops began surrendering without fighting, they assumed equipment failure or communication breakdown. They never considered that the widow's stories about her husband's integrity had reached their soldiers and made them question their cause. How did the Empire's most powerful leaders fall for diplomatic pleasantries that were actually psychological warfare? They fell because their entire framework for understanding conflict was based on physical dominance. They expected enemies to declare themselves through violence or threat. When the widow offered smiles and stories instead of ultimatums, they categorized her as non-threatening. Their cultural blindness made them vulnerable to a form of warfare they didn't recognize as combat. They evaluated her based on their own cultural norms where emotion signaled weakness and diplomacy indicated submission. They interpreted her calm demeanor as defeat rather than control. They read her cultural references as primitive rather than coded. Their translation systems converted her strategic language into sentimental phrases. Their psychological profiles mistook her patience for passivity. The widow understood their blind spots because her husband had documented them during his intelligence work. She knew they would look for military buildup rather than narrative building. She knew they would monitor weapons production but not story propagation. She built her campaign around their arrogance, using their own contempt for human culture as the perfect camouflage for her operations. They debated response protocols in endless meetings, analyzing threat scenarios and developing contingency plans. They created new committees and task forces to study the widow phenomenon. They commissioned psychological profiles and cultural analyses. They developed complex models that all failed to account for the simple fact that she was fighting a different kind of war entirely. She implemented final phase. While they were still debating whether she constituted a serious threat, her operatives moved into position using the patterns she had established through years of apparent mourning. The Imperial leadership finally recognized the pattern as their own systems began collapsing. But by then, the window for effective response had closed. Their debate ended when the lights went out across their command center. She entered the Imperial heart without weapons or escort. Security scanned her 7 times, searching for energy signatures, biological agents, concealed technology. They found nothing but a human woman in simple black clothing, her hands empty, her posture unthreatening. Their sensors reported normal vital signs, standard human biochemistry, no anomalous readings. They categorized her as low-risk profile, a grieving widow seeking audience. Their protocols were designed for assassins and soldiers, not for someone who carried only memory and purpose. The Emperor himself received her, expecting surrender or plea for mercy. He sat on the obsidian throne, surrounded by advisors and guards. The power of the Empire concentrated in that single chamber. He watched her approach with the confidence of someone who believed the conflict was already resolved. His advisors had briefed him about the human tendency for emotional appeals in final moments. They anticipated tears, bargaining, perhaps desperate threats. They prepared responses for all these scenarios. She stopped before the throne, her black garments absorbing the chamber's harsh light. The air hummed with defensive systems and silent alarms, all indicating no threat from her presence. Then she spoke 7 words that reframed everything. I am not his shadow. I am his echo. The Emperor's translation device rendered this as poetic metaphor. His security team logged it as emotional statement. They completely missed that she had just declared herself operational rather than memorial. This reframed her authority from memory to active consequence. The shadow implies absence, but echo implies ongoing presence. She wasn't just carrying his legacy, she was continuing his work with perfect fidelity. The Emperor began to speak, to offer standard terms of surrender. But his words were interrupted by multiple alerts flashing across command displays. Human fleets breached orbit with surgical precision, hitting targets that shouldn't have been vulnerable, following approaches that shouldn't have been possible. The Emperor's blade faltered as his own defenses turned against him. Security systems he'd believed impregnable began reporting failures. Communication channels transmitted surrender orders he hadn't given. Patrol ships changed allegiance without firing a shot. The attack followed patterns discussed during her morning tour, the same patterns Imperial analysts had dismissed as cultural curiosity. The questions about architecture became breach points. The interest in local customs revealed loyalty fractures. The entire campaign unfolded exactly as she had mapped it during those years of apparent mourning. What was the widow's true identity beyond grieving wife that no alien suspected? She was her husband's operational successor, trained by him during their marriage to continue his work if he fell. Their domestic life had been preparation for this moment. The coffee rituals practiced battle coordination. The baseball games rehearsed fleet maneuvers. The shared smiles synchronized attack timings. She hadn't just loved a general, she had been his second in command, his contingency plan, the echo of his strategic mind. The Emperor reached for weapons that were no longer responsive. His personal guard found their systems offline. The throne room's defensive measures, designed to neutralize immediate threats, couldn't counter what was happening. The attack wasn't coming from outside. It was unfolding within their own networks, using access she had gained through years of careful social engineering. Every diplomatic meeting, every cultural exchange, every sympathetic conversation had been another thread woven through their defenses. He reached for weapons. She had already taken them. The blasters failed to activate. The emergency protocols returned error messages. The Imperial Guard stood immobilized as their systems recognized her authority codes. The same codes she'd collected from grieving officers during her morning tour, offered as tokens of respect that she had repurposed as access keys. The Emperor finally understood that she hadn't come to surrender. She had come to witness the conclusion of a campaign fought with patience rather than fury, with memory rather than metal, with exactly the weapons they had dismissed as unimportant. Her final transmission reached every corner of the Empire simultaneously, bypassing their security protocols through civilian emergency bands and cultural exchange frequencies. Imperial communications couldn't block what they didn't understand as attack. Their filters scanned for weapon signatures and encrypted codes while she used open channels and simple human language. Their systems classified the broadcast as cultural programming rather than strategic threat, allowing it to spread through their networks like water through cracked stone. She spoke not as conqueror but as human, reminding others of choices. Her voice carried no triumph or vengeance, only the steady tone of someone stating inevitable consequences. She stood before a simple backdrop, hands resting at her sides. No symbols of power or victory displayed. The Empire expected declarations of conquest or demands for surrender. They prepared responses to threats and ultimatums. They received neither. We are not monsters. We are not conquerors. We are simply human, and humans remember. The phrase echoed across translation systems, becoming clearer with each iteration rather than losing meaning. Imperial analysts scrambled to categorize this statement while their own subjects listened with increasing recognition. The words contained no threat, only statement of fact wrapped in quiet certainty. This reframed victory as deterrence rather than domination. She wasn't claiming territory but demonstrating consequence. The message wasn't about human expansion, but about imperial choice. Systems could remain aligned with the failing empire or choose different paths. The option was presented not as threat but as natural outcome. The distinction proved devastating to imperial cohesion. Entire star systems began abandoning the imperial banner within hours. The defection started at the periphery where imperial control was weakest, but belief in imperial invincibility had already been shattered. Governors declared neutrality, fleet commanders stood down, civilian populations openly rejected imperial authority. The collapse spread inward like structural failure, each system's departure weakening those that remained. The phrase, "choose peace, and humanity will smile with you," became galactic proverb almost immediately. It appeared on walls and communications channels, repeated by species who had never met a human, but understood the offer. The smile reference harkened back to her earlier campaign, now revealed as intentional pattern rather than emotional expression. Imperial attempts to counter this messaging failed because they couldn't understand its appeal. Imperial cohesion unraveled faster than their military could respond. Command structures designed for conventional warfare couldn't handle mass defection and psychological collapse. Units received conflicting orders, supply lines disintegrated, communication networks fragmented. Their overwhelming military advantage became irrelevant when the will to use it evaporated. What was the final broadcast that made entire star systems abandon the Empire overnight? It was the quiet voice of a woman explaining that memory outlasts metal and choices matter more than force. She described her husband's hands holding coffee cups while planning defense of civilian populations. She recalled his insistence that true strength protects rather than dominates. These simple memories became more powerful than any threat because they offered an alternative to imperial control. The broadcast ended with 7 words that became the foundation of the new order. We remember, we choose, we continue. No victory declaration, no demands, no list of terms. Just the quiet statement that humanity would persist and others could join that persistence if they wished. The simplicity made imperial propaganda seem clumsy and false by comparison. They tried to counter-broadcast. Their channels were silent. Not because of jamming or sabotage, but because their own population stopped listening. The imperial transmission centers found themselves speaking to empty space, their elaborate productions and carefully crafted messages echoing unheard. The widow had not conquered the airwaves. She had made them irrelevant by speaking truth to people who were finally ready to hear it. The silence that followed her broadcast was more devastating than any explosion. The widow's closing words became galactic legend. They spread through the rubble of imperial stations and across liberated worlds, repeated by beings who had never seen a human but understood finality. Storms do not end when thunder fades. They end only when the lightning has burned everything it touches. This described both her campaign and the new reality she created. The quiet aftermath of systematic demolition, where peace felt less like victory and more like cleared ground. The Empire's infrastructure collapsed not from bombardment, but from lost legitimacy. Their command centers stood intact but empty, their communication networks silent not from damage but from disuse. The weapons remained in arsenals, the ships docked at stations, but the will to use them had evaporated like morning mist. The lightning had burned their authority away, leaving only the structural skeleton of what had been an empire. Her aides moved with precision she had taught them through years of preparation. They were the general's general executing a plan conceived in grief and refined through patience. They coordinated not with military commands but with the patterns she had established. The coffee brew times signaling resource allocation, the baseball analogies directing perimeter security, the gardening terms managing territory control. They worked with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained by a master through domestic routine, rather than drill instruction. They were the unseen architects of the new order, implementing protocols based on marital conversations and shared mourning rituals. The campaign demonstrated that patience could be more destructive than fury, that a carefully tended grudge could achieve what fleets of warships could not. The Imperial military had prepared for frontal assault and never considered the possibility of being dismantled from within by someone who understood their systems better than they did themselves. Her husband's sacrifice became the foundation for new galactic order, not through dramatic gestures but through meticulous transfer of knowledge. The burned toast remembered from breakfast conversations indicated vulnerable supply points where overheating occurred during production cycles. The sleepless nights she described mapped onto shift change vulnerabilities at key facilities. How did burned toast and sleepless nights become the foundation for supply line disruptions? The general had used their domestic life as living intelligence archive, embedding operational data in stories about their marriage that she later decoded into attack parameters. The toast burning at exactly 7 minutes correlated with Imperial fuel refinement, cycles where critical overheating occurred if not monitored. His inability to sleep past 4:17 a.m. matched the temporal gap between patrol rotations at 3 major shipyards. These small domestic details became the timing mechanisms for coordinated strikes. The Empire fell not to overwhelming force but to perfect understanding of its operational rhythms, all gathered through what appeared to be marital intimacy. The storm ended not with celebration but with assessment. The rebuilding began not with grand declarations but with quiet realignment. Systems that had been bound by Imperial force now negotiated freely. The widow's influence receded into the background, her work done, her husband's memory honored not through monuments but through functioning systems. The lightning had burned away the old structures, leaving clean space for something new to grow. The thunder faded, but the changed landscape remained as permanent testimony. Her influence became known as the widow's shadow across liberated space. The term carried no threat, only quiet recognition of her methods and reach. Systems that had never seen a human warship knew the stories about the woman who defeated an empire without firing a shot. The name traveled faster than rumor, becoming shorthand for consequence and patience. Leaders made calculations based not on military capability, but on whether their actions might attract her attention. The myth prompted risk assessments everywhere. Planetary governors considered their policies not just for immediate effect, but for how they might appear in her strategic calculus. Trade agreements included clauses about human interests that hadn't existed before. The shadow wasn't fear so much as awareness that actions now carried different weights. Systems began self-correcting not from pressure, but from understanding that someone was watching who measured things differently. Other species began aligning with humanity's memory and promise. They saw not conquest but consistency, not domination but durability. The widow had demonstrated that human values could protect as well as Imperial force could threaten. Alliances formed based on shared interest in the stability she represented. The galactic balance shifted not through treaties but through quiet realignment toward principles that had proven stronger than weapons. The campaign demonstrated that perceived weakness could become overwhelming strength. Her tears at the funeral had been catalogued as vulnerability, her mourning tour registered as emotional processing. Her domestic stories were filed as cultural curiosity. The Empire's analysts measured the wrong things because they couldn't conceive of grief as strategy or memory as weapon. Their failure to recognize her true nature became their undoing. Her methods became case study in psychological warfare academies. Instructors analyzed how she turned social rituals into command structures. Students studied the coffee gambit and the circle strategy as examples of perfect misdirection. The Imperial collapse provided textbook examples of how to dismantle systems through understanding rather than force. Her approach became required reading for anyone studying asymmetric conflict. The Empire's collapse came from within, through precise subversion rather than assault. Their own arrogance became the delivery system for their defeat. Their cultural blind spots provided the openings she needed. Their belief in their superiority made them vulnerable to attacks they didn't recognize as combat. The widow didn't break their systems. She simply showed their subjects they could stop participating. Human ingenuity and resilience were affirmed through her calculated campaign. She proved that preparation could overcome power, that patience could defeat aggression. The tools of her victory weren't advanced technology or overwhelming force, but understanding and timing. She showed that knowing an enemy's patterns mattered more than matching their strength. The satisfaction came from seeing arrogance unravel through invisible strikes. There was no grand battle, no final confrontation that could be mythologized. Instead, there was the quiet accumulation of small actions that gradually made the empire impossible to maintain. The widow's revenge wasn't about causing pain, but about demonstrating that their power had always been an illusion. How did the widow's quiet revenge dismantle an empire from within? She used their own systems against them, turning their procedures into vulnerabilities and their arrogance into blinders. She understood that empires fall not when they're attacked, but when they stop being believed in. Her campaign consisted of demonstrating that their control was conditional on participation, rather than inevitable. She didn't conquer territory, she conquered perception. They remembered her husband not as a martyr but as a teacher. They remembered her not as an avenger but as an executor. The general had built the knowledge base during their life together. The widow implemented the plan after his death. Together, they demonstrated that some things persist when empires fall: memory, principle, and the willingness to endure until the right moment. The shadow that fell across the galaxy wasn't darkness, but the shape of things finally becoming clear. Her enduring message to the galaxy was both warning and invitation. The words traveled through rebuilt networks and newly free systems, carrying the weight of demonstrated consequence. Choose peace and humanity will smile with you. Choose war and humanity will smile still. This simple formulation contained the entire lesson of her campaign, the distilled essence of what she had proven through action rather than declaration. This reframed human resilience as constant rather than reactive. It wasn't about responding to threats, but about maintaining core principles regardless of circumstance. The smile wasn't conditional on external factors, but represented internal consistency. Systems that had expected negotiation or ultimatums found themselves facing neither, only the quiet assurance that human presence would continue with or without their cooperation. The narration closed on a quiet, relentless note that would echo through diplomatic channels for generations. They'll remember you, and through you, they'll remember me. This connected individual choice to collective memory, making every decision part of larger historical pattern. Leaders understood that their actions would be measured not just against immediate consequences, but against permanent record. The storm that began as grief ended as calculated memory-anchored resurgence. The weeping widow at the funeral had been the first phase of operations, the apparent collapse that concealed preparation. What seemed like emotional breakdown was actually strategic positioning. The empire fell not to overwhelming force but to perfect understanding of its weaknesses, all gathered through what they dismissed as sentimental behavior. She married sorrow to inevitability, and turned mourning into galaxy-shaping dawn. The grief became fuel rather than obstacle. The memory became guide rather than burden. Her husband's sacrifice wasn't wasted loss but intentional investment in something larger. The campaign demonstrated that emotion could be harnessed rather than suppressed, that personal loss could become collective gain if properly channeled. The campaign demonstrated that power dynamics could shift through patient subversion. She didn't challenge imperial strength directly, but undermined its foundations through careful, consistent pressure. The empire collapsed not from external assault but from internal erosion, their certainty gradually replaced by doubt, their arrogance overcome by persistent reality. The change happened so gradually they didn't recognize it until too late. Human strength was redefined from overt force to calculated precision. The widow showed that victory could come through understanding rather than destruction, through timing rather than fury. Her weapons weren't ships and bombs, but patterns and knowledge. Her battlefield wasn't space, but perception. The new galactic order valued intelligence over intimidation, preparation over proclamation. What was the widow's philosophy that reframed sacrifice as sustenance rather than surrender? She treated loss not as something to be avenged, but as something to be utilized. Her husband's death became operational capital rather than personal tragedy. The grief became strategic resource. The memory became tactical advantage. She demonstrated that sacrifice could feed future action, rather than deplete present capacity, that what was taken could be repaid with interest through careful application. The stars reordered themselves according to new principles of engagement. Systems that had been bound by imperial force now connected through mutual interest and demonstrated respect. The lesson remained visible in every interaction, every decision, every calculation of risk and reward. The Widow's campaign became the new standard for conflict resolution, studied not for its violence but for its effectiveness, not for its destruction but for its precision. The quiet after the storm wasn't silence but equilibrium. The rebuilding followed patterns she had established through her careful campaign, the same attention to detail that had characterized her approach to dismantling the Empire. New alliances formed based on understanding rather than domination, on mutual benefit rather than imposed will. The galaxy learned that some things endure when empires fall, that memory outlasts metal, and that patience can achieve what force cannot. The lesson remained encoded in daily operations and strategic planning. Military academies taught her methods as examples of psychological warfare. Diplomatic corps studied her communications as models of effective messaging. The Widow had not just defeated an empire, she had changed how power was understood and exercised. Her legacy wasn't territory controlled but principles demonstrated, not conquest achieved but possibilities revealed. In the aftermath, systems defected and fleets faltered across former imperial space. The collapse unfolded not as explosion but as exhalation, a gradual release of tension that had built over years of calculated pressure. Stations that had flown imperial banners for generations lowered them without ceremony. Ships that had patrolled border worlds returned to dock and powered down. The change happened quietly, without declaration or celebration, as if the galaxy had simply decided to breathe differently. The Widow's influence multiplied into coordinated web of disruptions. Her network of human operatives and alien allies continued executing protocols she had established during her morning tour. Supply lines redirected resources to rebuilding rather than military expansion. Communication channels that had carried imperial propaganda now transmitted reconstruction coordinates. The patterns she had embedded in casual conversations became the foundation for new systems of cooperation. The new era spread through diplomacy and fear in equal measure. Some systems joined the emerging order from genuine belief in its principles. Others aligned because they had seen what happened when the Widow's attention focused on resistance. The calculation was simple. Cooperation brought stability, opposition brought consequence. The choice was clear to those who had watched an empire dismantle itself through arrogance. An elder alien finally voiced what others refused to believe. His scaled face turned toward the star chart showing the changing allegiances, his voice a dry rustle in the command center silence. "She's not grieving," he said, claws clicking against the display. "She is maneuvering." The realization came too late for the Empire, but just in time for those who needed to understand the new reality. His words became warning and explanation for the changes sweeping through former imperial space. The simple, disarming humor became chilling emblem of strategic deception. Stories about coffee and baseball took on new meanings in the reconstruction phase. When human advisors mentioned brewing times during infrastructure meetings, alien engineers now listened for operational timing. When they discussed sports strategy, officials looked for organizational patterns. The Widow had trained everyone to listen differently, to understand that ordinary things could carry extraordinary meanings. Her aides acknowledged her as the general's general, with precision coordination. They spoke of her in terms of operational excellence rather than personal emotion. Their reports described timing and execution rather than grief or vengeance. They implemented her plans with the same meticulous attention she had shown, turning the patterns of domestic life into protocols for galactic stability. The coffee rituals became synchronization methods for reconstruction teams. The baseball analogies guided resource distribution. The plan demanded restraint, patience, and awareness of burning everything touched. She had shown that victory required knowing when not to act as much as when to strike. Her campaign demonstrated that some systems needed to fail completely before better ones could emerge. The satisfaction came from seeing the Empire's arrogance unravel through precise strikes against its foundations rather than its structures. They fell because they stopped believing in themselves, and she had known exactly how to make that happen. How did the Widow's campaign affirm human ingenuity and resilience? She proved that understanding could defeat strength, that knowledge could overcome power. Her methods showed that human culture contained strategic depth that imperial analysis had completely missed. The coffee rituals and baseball games and gardening metaphors weren't just customs. They were frameworks for thinking that could be weaponized against those who dismissed them as primitive. She demonstrated that the smallest details of daily life could contain the keys to galactic change when properly understood and applied. The calculation ended when the last Imperial station switched allegiance. The memory endured in the new systems being built, in the patterns of cooperation that followed the same rhythms she had established. The Widow's influence faded into the background as the galaxy healed, but the lesson remained, that some victories come not through force but through patience, not through destruction, but through understanding. The memory of her husband became part of that lesson, his sacrifice now woven into the fabric of a galaxy that had learned to see strength differently. The Widow's campaign redefined galactic power through patience and perception. She fought with memory instead of metal, using coffee rituals and baseball stories as weapons. The Empire fell not to bombardment but to understanding their own weaknesses. Her final message echoes across rebuilt systems. Choose peace and humanity will smile with you. Choose war and humanity will smile still. The lesson wasn't about victory but about persistence. They'll remember the general who shared tactics over breakfast. They'll remember his wife who turned grief into strategy. They'll remember the cost of underestimating human resolve. The stars realigned. The quiet remains.